Welcome to the Michele Tafoya podcast.
So I've never met Witt. I've never spoken to him before. This will be a first, and I'm really excited because I'm deep into his book, Do Not Comply. He first kind of gives you this overview of how we are in decline in this country, and it's heartbreaking. And I didn't know what to expect. I read the foreword by Dennis Prager, who's I think a great mind. Talk about this book and sort of what the genesis of it was, why you decided to write Do Not Comply.
Well, thank you so much for that. And obviously, Dennis Prager, I worked for PragerU for 5 years. He's a mentor to me. So if you guys read the book and you're like, oh, that sounds like something Dennis might say in some parts, it's because he's kind of one of the guys who's inspired me more than really anyone else in the world, even though, he's Jewish, I'm Christian, and a lot of my book has a lot of Christian values, but he's still just one of the most brilliant thinkers on this earth right now. But in terms of why I wrote the book, I think the title kind of plays it out for us right there. Do not comply. What is it that all these people want us to do? They want us to comply. This isn't just COVID with lockdowns and masks and vaccines. This is the bureaucrats. This is the Democrats, the Rhino Republicans. This is the big pharma. This is the teachers union, the big media, big tech. All these different entities want to turn you into a slave. And so I wrote this book essentially as what I would say is an antidote to these people's corruption, to these people's greed. How do we break free from all of the things that they are trying to make us comply with? It's about being an individual and standing for integrity all that you can.
When you use the word slave, that could inflame some people. That could make some people think, oh, how could you possibly use that word? Words are toxic these days. You got to stay away from certain words. But what do you mean when you say slave?
Well, Frederick Douglass said that to make a contented slave, you need to have a thoughtless one. And I thought that was pretty eye-opening when I heard that. And that what we have today is more of a Brave New World type of slave than a 1984 type of slave. In the novel 1984, you have Big Brother coming down. He's watching every move. The people know that they are being watched. Versus if you ever read the novel Brave New World, It is positive reinforcement. It is positive reinforcement that turns you into a slave because you essentially can do anything you want. There are no consequences for immorality, and any sort of thing that you could ever want, someone provides it for you. Think about the United States. The United States spent $22 billion on welfare. I mean, it's 22% of our national budget is spent on welfare every single year. That's an abhorrent amount of money that we are spending on welfare, giving people handouts so that they can just sit around and do drugs and vices and all these kind of things. And then you look at a place like American colleges that are essentially just places where you can go and fulfill every vice and drink and party and sleep around and all these kind of things. We are building a brave new world where you no longer have a moral compass because morality is always subjective in the eyes of these leaders. And that's exactly what they want. They want to give you everything you need, make it so that you are safe in your little bubble. You get a trophy for everything. And in that case, people are never going to rebel because they're too safe to ever think about what is actually being done to them.
It's interesting. There's one line in the American reality section of the book, and you talk about America and much of Western Europe, for that matter, also lets in hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants and refugees, often from cultures inferior to our own. And we are facing this immigration crisis in America. It is what's going on is criminal in my mind, but not because I have anything against these people, not because I have any thoughts about anything except for the cartels are doing this to us. And our administration is letting it happen to us. But when you say that cultures are inferior to ours, I want to give you an opportunity to clarify what you mean by that.
Right. Well, you think about some of the things that go on in the Middle East, the way they treat women, the way they treat homosexuals. These are, I would say, are inferior to Western values of equality and liberty and freedom that we have after the Enlightenment did a lot of that to the West. There are obviously things in the West right now going on that I would say, hey, maybe the Islamic world has some things right too. You can kind of look at some of the things. But overall, as a whole, I think that the Western way of life and Western ideals are the way forward for the best way to live. They're based on Christian values. And for me as a strong Christian, I would say that Christian values are the best way that you should live. And if you don't align your culture with Christian values, then it probably is inferior. You had in the 1800s, you had the practice of sati. which in India, this was the practice of if a man died, they would burn his wife to death with the wife. Now, for me, I can pretty clearly say that that is inferior to the way that the West would do it, in the way that if you died, you wouldn't burn your wife alive if you died, right? And so you look at things like this and you can say, okay, there are things that are different in other cultures, and there are things that are better about Western culture. Not everyone who comes from a different place is going to be some worse person. We have plenty of terrible Americans and terrible Westerners. But overall, as a culture, I think that Western culture does it better than anyone else.
I want to go a little bit deeper first into this World Economic Forum. And what is their end game?
I think the end game of the World Economic Forum is, this might sound a little dramatic, but it is to herald themselves as new gods of the world. Nietzsche said it best when he said, God is dead and we have killed him. What happens when you destroy Christianity and morality in the West? You have to have some sort of religion or system to replace it. Mm-hmm. So right now you have leftism. You have the ideals of the World Economic Forum that come and have that, because humans are naturally religious. You go back thousands and thousands of years, you have humans praying to climate gods or, old school Judaism and Islam and all these things. Humans are naturally religious. They will latch onto something. So if you destroy the Christian values in the West, then they still need something. That is where this comes in. That is where the World Economic Forum comes in, the leftism, these companies trying to push ESG, all of this, it turns you into a devoted follower of their agenda because this is what gives your life meaning. Think about the lives of young people. We talked a little bit about it. They don't have meaning. They don't have purpose. They don't have a sense of adventure or quest in their life. They grow up in these urban hellholes and answer emails all day and engage in every vice imaginable. And they don't have any sort of passion. So the leftism religion comes in and says, we will give your life meaning. We will give you something here. Go care about the world ending from climate change. That is your life now. Mother Nature is God. The gender stuff. This is your new religion to latch onto this trans ideology. It is about creating themselves as these new gods. They have this hubris that is almost unimaginable within human history of these types of people and the power that they wield over others. I really think that it comes down to a trying to create themselves as gods on this earth type of mentality.
It's really bizarre. I can't even imagine that. Like if you're a normal human, you're just kind of wanting to live your life happily. But what you say about religion is fascinating. And I, as I go along in life, I continue to see, you know what? People are naturally religious. And if they don't have Christianity or Judeo-Christian values of any kind of faith-based religion, then yes, they go to the climate crisis stuff feels religious to me. The gender ideology feels religious to me. This fight for equity and inclusion feels like a religion to me. So am I hearing you right in that these are the new religions for our young people because we've essentially taken God out of the equation?
That's exactly right. And you think about something like climate change again and the religion of green, as I call it. I made a documentary about this a few years ago. But you have, instead of having the Messiah be Jesus or God or some, faith that you are looking to, faith, hope, and love, as you would have in Christianity, it is now, oh, I am the Messiah. I am the one who is coming in to save the world. It's very seductive and intoxicating to people to think that, wow, this new religion that I'm a part of, I'm now the savior. Wow, that is my entire life. I will base my entire life on this now because I am the savior of the world. Not some God, not some objective moral truths. That's not the savior. It's me. So when you have that be the case, it's very difficult to take people away from that mindset because it is all about themselves. I mean, we live in the most vain and narcissistic society of probably all of human history, especially with young people today. And that is because of this. That is because of social media. And it's because there is no objective moral truth for them to follow. Of course, there is one, but they refuse to, or they haven't been exposed to it. Like, think about the politics right now in this 2024 election. I feel like a lot of the people who are participating in it are bad faith actors, Republicans included. I don't feel like there's much goodness with many of the people running for office and many of the people who are working in the campaigns. It feels more like business as usual. It feels like politics is a business. They're not worried about goodness in this country. And so what I mean by that is that if we had individuals who could fix their own lives and start working on goodness the most that they can in their own lives, it's going to create a culture of people who want to do good, who then get together collectively to institute that good in society. But if you have people who are only focused on the collective before focusing on themselves, then we're not really going to be getting the things done that we need to get done. It's like people are always asking, well, when will the president change? When will America change? When will my community change? But they're never asking, when will I change? When will I do something to be this person who I want others to be? We're always looking for someone else to be good, but never looking in the mirror and saying, well, what can I do today to be good? If we all did that, I mean, think about the voting block and the courage and the amount of community we could have of people in America if we all put forth that we are going to be good people and put that above, oh, I'm going to be a Republican person. I'm going to be a good person.
Will, it's a tremendous book. I can't wait to finish it because I am at the point where I wanted to cry because you're spot on. Here's the thing. When you write these first chapters, an analysis of where we are in America, you're spot on. I couldn't argue with any of it. So I got as far as I could before I fell asleep late in the wee hours. I can't wait to finish it because I'm looking forward to the hopeful part.
Thank you.
I truly mean that. I hope we can have you back because I think there's a lot of conversation to be had here. And it's so great to meet you, and I congratulate you on a really an important piece of writing that I hope a lot of people will read. Gerard Baker. He has granted me permission to call him Jerry Baker of the Wall Street Journal has a new book out called American Breakdown. Let me read you one sentence. It's no accident that if you ask the leaders of the institutions that have seen the greatest declines in trust over the last 50 years, government, media, universities, big business, some version of Trump's to blame is probably the answer they would give to the question of why trust has declined. It's not their fault. It's all the fault of some malevolent, lying narcissist, some serpent-like creature who corrupted America's Garden of Eden.
You know, I've actually written a little bit in the past about the way Hollywood, in particular, has gone from being essentially a kind of, a business that's a cultural activity that kind of fairly reflected, I think, the values of America. You go back, whether back in the 40s, the great war movies of the 40s, or the great musicals, or great dramas of the 1950s and 60s, and there was an increasingly important political dimension, but there was never this kind of relentless sense that of America as a deeply flawed, corrupt, dysfunctional, terrible country, which I'm afraid is the kind of character of movies that have been made in the last 10 or 15 years. And so it's a very interesting way of thinking about it, Michelle. You're right. As you say, I first came to this country in 1986. Reagan, it was we're into the second term of Reagan. The country was doing very well. It was kind of morning in America. There was a sense that, things were on the up, and that was reflected, I think, in the culture of the time. And in the 1990s, when I came to move here, I moved to Washington in late 1996. It was just Bill Clinton had just been reelected. We were before the Monica Lewinsky trauma that we were all put through before that. But it was also, and I quite often reflect on the 1990s as a time of real sort of the pinnacle of American achievement and success. The Cold War was over. The economy was booming. Inflation was relatively low. The internet was just taking off. There was this incredible sense that America had really demonstrated to the world the superiority of its model, the superiority of its values. It had defeated all comers in the 20th century. People talked about the end of history, all of that stuff, which sadly didn't turn out to be true. And I think just, again, and this is the thrust of my book, Michelle, think about how in just a generation, we've lost that. And again, not everybody liked Bill Clinton. I wasn't a big fan of Bill Clinton, certainly not his personal behavior. Right. But you go back and look at where America was in the late 1990s, post-Cold War, winning hot wars in Iraq and Kosovo, as I say, all of the economic success it was having, and the level of general sense of cohesion and purpose about the country was extraordinary at the time. And that in a generation has just been lost.
That is what's so astonishing, is how quickly this seems to have happened. And certainly we can point to moments like George Floyd, like the pandemic in recent years, that seem to have been opportune times to really get people to sort of put their stakes in the ground and argue about stuff, cultural stuff. But this idea of, the patriarchy and white supremacy and those kinds of identity politics that have been really starting to crop up seem to be a large part of this. The first chapter of your book really talks about trust and how much trust has been lost in so many institutions. And as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, even the things that, the studies now that come out to talk about the loss of trust, can I trust those studies to be telling me the truth? I don't know whom to believe anymore. What do you think the genesis of this is?
Well, I think the main genesis is, unfortunately, people have been lied to for so many years. I mean, that is, I wrote the book about trust and about the collapse of trust based on all the data that we have about how much, public trust in major American institutions has fallen dramatically in the last 30 years. But in a sense, it's not a crisis of trust. It's not that the American people have just suddenly, for no reason, withheld their trust from institutions like the media, higher education, government, law enforcement, big business, science, technology, all those things that I look at in the book. It's that those institutions have themselves forfeited that trust, Michele. It's that they've told us things that we have had reason to doubt, or frankly had reason to discover were just not true. And again, whether that's the government is responsible for a lot of that, I'm sorry to say, but a lot of what the government told us in the early 2000s about, the war on terror, about the war in Iraq, and I, by the way, let me say immediately, I was a strong supporter of the war in Iraq, but we were told things that weren't true. No wonder people don't trust in what the government says about things that are going on in the world, particularly like Ukraine right now. Again, I'm a supporter of what the administration is doing in Ukraine, but so many people have seen the government essentially tell them untruths over the last 20 years. So the government's lost its credibility. The media, what you and I work in, Michele, have dramatically lost their credibility. That in the 1970s, after Watergate, something like 3/4 of Americans said they generally trusted what they read in news organizations. That number's down below 20% today, and again, understandably, because we've seen news organizations pursue these ideological views, dressing it up as news when people can see, and thanks to the internet in particular, that's one of the big things that's contributed to this, they can now test what they read or see on television against what they get, where they get alternative sources of information, and they can see the bias. They can see the way that people are being willfully misled, where the organizations are willfully misleading people. So, that's gone. We've had the pandemic. Trust was, weakened in the medical profession, in public health during the pandemic, in scientists. We had scientists, telling us on the one hand that you couldn't go out and protest against lockdowns or because that was a public health danger. But not only could you go out and protest, over the George Floyd murder, protests against supposed police brutality, but actually it was necessary to go out and protest. That was an act that was designed that actually would improve public health. Well, no wonder people don't trust. No wonder people stop trusting Anthony Fauci and the medical establishment, because they were telling us these things that were just, so obviously not true. So, we have over this period of 20, 25 years, Michele, again, you just started off talking about the 1990s, we've seen institution after institution essentially fall to what I describe as an elite with values that are completely out of touch, that actually are contrary to American values, historical values, and have tried to turn the country against itself. And it's for that reason that I think trust has collapsed so dramatically.
When we talk about that country turning against itself, and I see it regularly, and I wonder if this is so intentional, if this started, as some people suggest, back in the 1920s with Marxist folks coming into this country and starting this programming, if you will, or if this is just really what people believe, and that they think they can make this place so much better without any real knowledge of what the rest of the world looks like. I wonder what they think better actually looks like.
Yeah. I think a few trends have been in place. Again, some of the things you described, Michele, a few trends have been in place that explain this, the way in which these elites have taken over these institutions. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of it does go back, especially in education, to a kind of Marxist class. Particular, what was interesting about, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and China was essentially becoming, embracing sort of capitalist ideas, at least in the economy, and actually starting to grow. Marxist economic ideas were thoroughly discredited. I mean, we'd had 100 years, as you say, of sort of the march of Marxist ideologues through our institutions, through many of our academic institutions. We'd had this sort of tension throughout the Cold War between, was Marxism a better way for the world to work, or was capitalism and freedom? Anyway, well, that was really resolved with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the realization in China that they had to embrace free market reforms. So what happened? So these Marxists then, they didn't really want to let go of their ideology. They changed it from the economic field to the cultural field, and essentially saying, okay, well, maybe the idea that the world is made up of an economic structure whereby capitalists are exploiting workers, maybe, okay, that idea wasn't so good, but we've got an alternative model for you, which is based on race and gender, and this idea of, critical theory, this fundamental idea that society operates with these power structures, exercised, by white male patriarchy in particular, and everybody else, in this sort of intersectional theory is somehow the victims of that oppression. So the sort of Marxism lived on. Another factor, and in fact, Marxism lived on and sort of reinvented itself in the kind of post-Cold War period and became so widely believed. A second factor, I think, really played a big role in the dilution or the collapse of trust in American institutions driven by these elites pursuing their own objectives was globalization. This became the mantra after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that the world was coming together. It was, that we'd had periods like this in the past in the world, but this was seen much more intense. As I say, the old Cold War barriers had broken down. China was emerging into the world economy. You had this kind of Davos man phenomenon of people, going to, Davos every year, the famous World Economic Forum, and talking about the virtues of an integrated world. And what they meant by that was essentially an integrated world that would work for big business, and that would be, borderless sort of trade, borderless movements of labor, meaning immigration, unlimited immigration. This became a dominant sort of theory, almost a theology among the kind of ruling classes on both sides of the political spectrum. It's really important to say that. Democrats embraced globalization as enthusiastically as Republicans had previously done, and Republicans embraced it too. And what that ignored was the damage that globalization did to communities here at home, whether it was the loss of jobs, whether it was the impact of immigration, whether it was the sort of cultural decline that was represented by all of that, and what the way that the form that commitment to globalization also then took was the idea that the nation state was somehow, invalid or somehow illegitimate, and that we had no right to keep people out. We had no right to assert our national values because we were all part of one great global community where we would all just, we'd all live happily ever after. And so and American values are so distinctively American. America was the country that was founded as an ideal, a country where people came here, to enjoy their freedom, to enjoy the economic opportunities that they could have. These elites became actually hostile to that very idea because no, American idea, because we now believe in this globally connected world, American values are no better than European values, right, or even Chinese values, or values of those people who are in the Middle East. And I think this elite, which took control then of the media, took control of our universities, took control of much of our permanent government, took control of big business, these ideas, essentially transformed the people the institutions that these people controlled into these agents of values that were just not American fundamentally. And so I think it's those two of the things I identify most in the book as having contributed to this trend of this extraordinary rapid seizure of the major institutions by these elites, and why they have pushed those institutions away from the values that actually most Americans have long held, and actually the values that have genuinely made America great.
It is stunning to me how we can look at the world and suggest that all countries share the same ideals and we're all equal. And, there is not a such thing as American exceptionalism, which I think Barack Obama intimated in some comments of his during his presidency. Yeah. When you see that other countries, and China foremost among them, has an abysmal record of human rights. We continue to do our manufacturing there. We continue to rely on them for production of stuff that is regularly sold here. When at any time, I mean, they are so hostile to America, they could say, you know what? Maybe we'll just unleash a virus. I'm just suggesting that. Or maybe we'll stop exporting what it is that you need in this kind of Cold War way. Now we've got China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran forming this, what are some people are calling this new axis of evil. How badly did we underestimate China's power in this whole sort of hierarchy of terrible stuff?
The embrace of China was which characterized again both political parties after the end of the Cold War, characterized the way big business went about relation to China, was a mistake. It wasn't necessarily a mistake in terms of its economic opportunities. China's a growing economy, rapidly growing economy. It was a good thing that China was liberalizing its economy, that it was growing markets. That was a good thing. Were opportunities. Many people benefit from. Look at our iPhones, Michelle.
Right.
Most of our iPhones are made in China. They're great devices which we all love. So there's definitely economic benefits from this relationship. The problem, Michelle, was the way in which it was done, and in particular the assumptions, which I would say at best were naive and at worst were positively treasonous, about what the United States could achieve by this engagement. The idea that so many people had, presidents from Bill Clinton through George W. Bush and Barack Obama, based their engagement with China on the idea that, China's going to be like us. China's going to be, the more we engage with them, China's going to become a democracy. And that's the surest way to ensure that we don't have conflict with China if we're all democratic. We're all basically following the same values. That was an incredibly naive thing to think and believe. Again, you might have been forgiven for thinking it. I think, this idea emerged with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union practiced communism for 70 years. It had failed. Gorbachev had introduced, perestroika and glasnost, a bit of opening of society and economic restructuring. That had failed completely. The idea was that China was now embracing economic liberalism. It was embracing economic markets, and that inevitably that would either collapse or it would have to involve the opening of society too. China would become more democratic. That was the assumption. It was just wrong, and it was clearly wrong from quite an early stage. We, admitted China to the WTO at the end of the 1990s. China was going to do its own thing. It was liberalizing its economy, but it was also playing by its own rules. I mean, it was, stealing our intellectual property.
Right.
It was demanding companies transfer their technology into China before, if they were to do business there. It was treating, foreign companies, US companies, very unevenly in terms of the way they were allowed to operate there and kind of the regulations they were subject to. But we just said, okay, that's fine. We're just going to let them go on doing that. And at the same time, of course, we, all of this was helping China develop militarily and politically and become an incredibly powerful rival to the United States. So we, in the pursuit of what was seen as economic advantage, we made terrible mistakes in the way that we allowed China basically to fleece us repeatedly. And as you know, Michelle, I'm not the biggest fan of Donald Trump. I think a lot of what Donald Trump says and does is not particularly desirable, but why we'll give him credit for this. When he came in 2017 as president, he said that's going to stop. We're going to stop treating China as though, as though they're playing by the rules, as though they really are our friend in all of these things, as though somehow engaging with them is going to be of universal benefit for Americans. We're not. We're going to start imposing our own, respecting our own interests, imposing our own demands, and making sure that we're looking out for our own people in this relationship with China. That was very important. And actually, I give some credit to the Biden administration for following on in that. But that was a terrible mistake, Michelle, that was made, over a 20-year period from the 1990s up until the mid-teens.
American Breakdown is the name of the book. It is a fantastic read. I can't recommend it enough. Gerry Baker, I appreciate your time as always, and thank you so much. All the best with the book. I can't imagine it's not going to be a success because it is so important for the moment. The discussion about trust and faith in our institutions, it's critical. Thank you so much for your time.
Michele, it's a real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me again.
Likewise, he is Gerard Baker. We get to call him Jerry. The book is American Breakdown. Thanks for listening, everyone. Be brave, do good, and we will see you next time.